It's the fundamental life that's being lived that needs to change, not the external behaviors.
That doesn't create happiness, it creates more uncertain ground.
Because we learned how to ignore our feelings as children, now we learn to ignore them for the rest of our lives, and that then creates problems for us.
In the introduction, you say all drugs and all behaviors of addiction, substance dependent or not, whether gambling, sex, the internet or cocaine, all of them either soothe pain directly or distracts from it. Hence your mantra, the first question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And I think that beautifully sums it up. You know, in that you're likening addiction to drugs, potentially to, you know, sex, gambling, alcohol, maybe shopping.
Well, so I've had my own shopping addiction, and I can tell you that what happens in my brain when I'm indulged in my shopping addiction is exactly the same that happens in the brain of the cocaine addict. Yeah. In other words, there's an excitation of the reward, incentive, and motivation circuitry. And what the addict is after is that temporary change in brain status. Really what it is, all addictions are an attempt to regulate an unbearable emotional state internally. But you're trying to regulate your internal state through external means. And that's what an addiction is. So temporarily you get a change in the state of your brain, in a change of your physiology. You can do that through drugs. You can also do it through gambling or internet or sex or shopping. But essentially after that same revitalization of your incentive and motivation circuitry of your brain. And so from my perspective, there's only one universal addiction process that dominates all addicted people. The targets of addiction may be different. The internal effects are much the same.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I should add, when you look at the sources of it, the states that people are trying to escape are states of emotional distress, states of emotional pain, and hence why the addiction, not why the addiction, but why the pain.
So some people who are listening to this or watching this right now might be thinking, yeah, I get that all sounds fine for those people who are addicted, but I, of course, am not addicted to anything. So you've got a rather beautiful definition, I think, of addiction, which I think will be really helpful to sort of go through at the start here so that people listening can actually figure out if it does relate to them or not.
Well, when I speak to a room of people and I ask them how many are addicted, most people will only think of drugs, so some people put their hand up. Then I give them my broader definition of addiction, and not everybody puts their hand up. And that definition is that an addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in, and therefore craves, but suffers negative consequences in the long term, and is going to be able to give it up. So any behavior, not just drugs. The key hallmarks are craving, pleasure, relief in the short term, negative outcomes in the long term, inability to give it up. That's what an addiction is. And that could be to drugs, nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, the lethal and legal substances, or it could be to heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, fentanyl, cannabis, any number of other substances, but it could also be to sex, to gambling, to shopping, to eating, to work, to exercise, to the internet, to gaming, to pornography, to political power, to the acquisition of wealth, to the hoarding of objects, anything. And when you give that definition, and you ask people how many here would acknowledge some addiction in their life, sometimes the vast majority of people would put their hands up, which means to say that addictions are on a continuum, it's on a spectrum, and they're distributed, dispersed throughout all of our society. And so that the identified drug addicts make up only a small, narrow segment of our addicted population.
So really the whole way we think about addiction, the way we criminalize various forms of addiction really needs to change to a more compassionate way of dealing with it, but also really trying to understand what's the root cause. Because if, you know, I totally subscribe to your theories, and I think that ultimately, if the root cause of all addiction or all addictive behavior is the same, how do we tackle that? And where does that come from? What is that root cause?
So once you're asking not why the addiction, but why the pain, now you have to forget that it's a choice, because nobody chooses to be in pain. And you also have to forget the medical idea that it's an inherited brain disease. You actually have to look at people's lives. Now, in Vancouver's downtown east side in Canada, where I worked for 12 years, with a highly addicted population, these people had multiple addictions: cocaine, alcohol, cannabis, opiates of all kinds, cigarettes in every case. They suffered with HIV, with hepatitis C. They would die of overdoses, suicide, infections of all kinds. And these people, every single one of them had been heavily traumatized in childhood. All the women I worked with over 12 years had been sexually abused. All the men had been neglected or beaten or emotionally abused. I'm talking about now the severely addicted population, which is also what the large-scale study shows, that the greater the childhood adversity, the greater the risk for addiction in adulthood. Now, the more severe the childhood adversity, the greater the risk of substance addiction and injection use. However, if you look at my own case, I wasn't beaten, I wasn't abused in my family of origin, I wasn't neglected, but I was a Jewish infant born during the war in Hungary, and spent my first year under the Nazi regime. You can imagine under what circumstances. So I had a very unhappy, stressed, terrorized mother. And children can be hurt in two ways. Children can be hurt when bad things happen to them that shouldn't happen. That's the abuse, that's the violence in the family, that's the parental addiction. But children can also be hurt when their needs are not met. Now, I had this need for an attuned, empathetic, emotionally responsive mother. She couldn't be that. Not because she didn't love me, not because she didn't do her best, but simply she was too terrorized, she was too depressed. The lack of that joyful, attuned, loving mother who, I shouldn't say loving because she loved me tremendously, but her love couldn't be translated into responsive behavior. That alone was enough to hurt me. So, in other words, the source of addiction is always some kind of a childhood hurt, either because bad things happen that shouldn't have, or because the good things that should have happened couldn't happen because of the parents' emotional states. Both of these are enough to hurt the child in a way to driving them to self-soothe through addictions.
So do you think your own experience of trauma, really, as a young baby, not even a child, as a young baby, has impacted your own health, your own behaviors, and therefore ultimately where you are today, which is one of the world's leading voices on trauma and addiction? Do you think that has been instrumental in you getting to where you are today?
Having to deal with the impacts of that has been instrumental. I mean, I really, as an adult, I was a successful physician. You know, I was much in demand, family practitioner. I was head of a palliative care department at a major hospital. I was a national medical columnist for a Canadian newspaper in my 50s. And internally, I was driven, workaholic, depressed, affected by ADHD, anxious, and unfulfilled and unsatisfied. And it's when looking at those dynamics and wondering, well, what the heck has happened to me here, and what is the gap between my external persona and my internal experience of myself, that's when I began to deal with trauma. Not to mention, as a family physician, and you and I were talking about this before, we get to see patients before they get sick. The specialists only see them after the illness has been diagnosed. I get to see people before they get ill. I get to see people in their context of their multi-generational family background. So we have a much broader view of who gets sick and why. And so both through my medical work and having to deal with my own stuff, I began to realize the central role of trauma in shaping people's health or illness.
Yeah, since I've been studying trauma myself, both with the work that you do, but just other things that I'm reading around it, it really helps me understand my patients and their behaviors much better. I really you can start to tap in now as to what they're coming in with more. You think, oh, that's what's going on behind that, not the symptom they're describing, but why are they making those choices? And something you may not know, Gabor, I a few years ago, I did a series of documentaries on BBC One called Doctor in the House. And what I would do on that is I went to live alongside families who had health problems. They were already under GPs, they were already under specialists, they were all taking medication pretty much already, and they still weren't getting better and they were still struggling. So I went in to, sometimes I'd stay the night in their houses, I'd live alongside them, really get to understand, you know, what choices they were making with their lifestyle, sure, but also I'd get to see, you know, various dynamics in the family, the sort of thing that would never come up in the consultation room. Even if you ask that question, they would never even think to bring those things up. And you would just start to spot things and little dynamics. And I found that with every single family, pretty much now, if I reflect back on all those families I stayed alongside, I was very fortunate to get really good health outcomes with them all after about 6 weeks. But there was a huge emotional component behind a lot of the illness. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that it was in their head at all. They had proper physical symptoms that they were struggling with. And obviously that in some ways can make people feel down a little bit about themselves because they're not feeling so good. But I really got this strong sense that when you start to look at their lives and their upbringing and how they saw themselves, it was uncanny how many times their emotional health was absolutely tied into their physical health.
Well, so one of the books I've written, which will be published in Britain in a few months, is entitled When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress. And I'm making the case precisely as I heard you articulate just now, is that when it comes to chronic illness, and whether it's colitis or Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, ALS, or motor neuron disease in England, malignancy, chronic psoriasis, eczema, chronic fatigue syndrome, the physiological symptoms, which are not in people's heads in the sense that they're imagining them, but it very much originates in people's heads in that it has a lot to do with certain relational and emotional patterns that they adopted in childhood. In other words, what I'm saying is that because of childhood programming, people impose certain unconscious stresses on themselves, and those stresses, because of the unity of mind and body, which unfortunately is not taught or recognized in the medical schools, but which scientifically is not even vaguely controversial, because the immune system and the emotional apparatus and the hormonal apparatus and the nervous system are part and parcel of the same system. So when something occurs emotionally, which it does on a chronic basis, that has an impact of undermining people's physiology, turning their immune system against themselves or suppressing the immune system. So I absolutely agree that people's emotional patterns, which reflect not individual choices or mistakes, but multi-generational patterns in the family, those emotional patterns translate into physical illness. And if we can address those emotional dynamics, we can actually have an impact on the physiological course of their illness, which is again not something that anybody in medical school will ever tell you, because there's this unfortunate separation of mind and body that you and I are trained in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the key things there for me was that you're not putting blame on people.
There's no blame.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really a key point that maybe we can discuss now, because a lot of people may be hearing that feeling, you know, maybe I've done this to myself, or my mother did this to me, for example, and that's not what you're saying at all, is it?
Well, this is an interesting conversation. I make the distinction between blame and responsibility.
Okay.
Blame says that you did something that you could have done otherwise, and so therefore you're at fault. That's what blame says. Responsibility says, yes, you did this to yourself, but not consciously or deliberately. You did it because you're programmed to do it by your own childhood experience, which in turn was programmed by your parents' childhood experience. So there's nobody at fault. Everybody does their best, but we do pass these unconscious patterns on. And you don't blame people for having unconscious patterns. You try to make them conscious of it so they can take responsibility for it. So there's no responsibility without consciousness.
Yeah.
And so, and there's no blame. So I don't blame anybody for their illness. I don't blame their parents either. But I do say these unconscious patterns have been passed on, and these unconscious emotional dynamics have an impact on your physiology. That's all. And if you want to have an impact on your physiology, you got to get conscious. You have to realize what have you been doing unconsciously so you can stop doing it or do it differently. So it's a matter of liberating people from these ingrained patterns, for which they're not to be blamed. So in my world, there's no room for blame whatsoever. But there is room for helping people to become responsible, for helping people being response-able, being able to respond to their circumstances. And without awareness, none of us are response-able.
Yeah, I think if I think to my own life and my own health journey over the last few years, and I guess what's really changed for me over the last few years, I've done a lot with my lifestyle, I've done a lot with my nutrition, my sleep, and those things have been great and they've really helped me. But over the last few years, I've really been focused on my emotional health. I see a therapist pretty regularly, and I can always feel when I've got something new, some deeper layer that's starting to come out. I have a session or I go through some sort of therapy and I feel good. I feel, oh yeah, I've got it now. I get it why I do this. And it changes your behavior, certainly. But it's almost as you do that, there's multiple layers. It's like peeling back a layer of it's peeling back layers of the onion and newer things keep coming out, which has been, it's been really rewarding for me because, you talk about addiction and I think back to my own life and various things that I've done at certain points. I don't think anyone who knows me well, maybe my close friends, but most people probably wouldn't think that I've ever had an addiction because we have all these connotations about addiction. It's like being on a street corner or being a drug addict or something.
Yeah.
But everyone around me would know that I've got an addicted personality.
Yeah.
And I used to think that was my personality. That's the way I was born. What's weird, that as I start to process my own emotional baggage and I start to clear it, I'm no longer as an addictive person as I used to be. And that's why I kind of feel so strongly about the work that you're doing, because I kind of feel that wasn't my personality. That was the behavior I had to soothe something that I was missing.
Well, so how would I put it? I mean, I agree with your concept. I would use a different language around it.
Sure.
That was your personality, but it wasn't your person. It wasn't who you were. The personality itself is a defensive structure that we develop as a way of dealing with our pain. So much of what we consider to be our personality is actually an overlay upon our true selves. And so these weren't choices in childhood. For example, with my ADD, the tuning out. I never chose to tune out, but when I was an infant under the conditions that I've described, of being a Jewish infant under the Nazis, I had plenty of stress on me. And how does an infant deal with stress that they can't change? They tune out. And then the tuning out becomes programmed into my brain. And then so many years later, I'm diagnosed with ADD. It wasn't a choice that I made, it was an adaptation. So what I would say about the personality, including what you described as your addictive personality, it wasn't you, it was an adaptation that you took on as a way of surviving your childhood, as a way of soothing your pain. It's when we get older that we realize that there's something more to us than a personality, that the personality is actually a defensive cover for who we truly are. And as we start, like as you describe your own process, you go through therapy and you go through layers and then you realize, oh, that's not actually me.
Yeah.
And I'm freer without it. Then you realize that what we thought was the personality was actually just a defensive cover. And once we strip that defense off and we find it no longer necessary, we become much more true to ourselves, much more true to ourselves, so we become much more balanced and happier in our lives. So yes, it was the personality, but you are not your personality. That's how I would formulate it.
Yeah, no, I love the way you put that, actually. It really helps me think about it in a slightly different way. I think something came into my mind there, which is, and we were chatting a little bit about this before we got on air, about medicine and how reductionist it has become, the practice of medicine. And I think something like high blood pressure, for example, I think of as an appropriate response from the body to the signals that it's been given.
Absolutely.
And I think there's an analogy there with what you're saying, which is if you're surrounded by stress as a young baby, whatever that stress is, your brain is going to adapt to that. It's an appropriate response to the signals that your brain is getting. Is that fair to say?
That's right. So my next book is going to be entitled the myth of normal, illness and health in an insane culture. And when I say insane culture, I mean a culture that doesn't meet human needs. So if you take a condition like high blood pressure, for which, what's the medical term for high blood pressure?
Hypertension.
Hypertension. All right. And doctors, of course, say, our colleagues say, well, there's a few types of hypertension for which there's a cause, like kidney disease or some kind of hormonal disorder. But for most part, we don't know what causes high blood pressure.
Essential hypertension.
Essential. We call it essential, which basically we don't know what the heck we're talking about. That's what that means. Just take the word hypertension and slow it down a bit. Hypertension. 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 Maybe there's too much tension in people's lives, you know. And if you actually look at the rising rates of hypertension, it's got to do with social pressure and social stresses. And I know that usually when I take care of myself, I have the blood pressure of a young person. But there's been times in my life when I've been driven by stress, and I've had blood pressure ranges in the risky end of the scale. So for me, when my blood pressure goes up, it's a real warning. Buddy, you've got too much tension in your lives. You better do something about it. All we do in medicine is we hand out pills, or we tell people to lose weight, but we never address the sources of real tension in their lives. And I'd say that most hypertension, and so for example, if you look at black American males, they have much higher risk of hypertension than, say, white American males. What we say is genetic. No, it isn't. Their biological relatives in Africa do not have high blood pressure.
Right.
So it's an artifact of being a black male in essentially a racist society. And James Baldwin, the American writer, once said that being a black American male is to live in a condition of suppressed rage all the time.
Yeah.
Well, that suppressed rage will drive your blood pressure. So hypertension...
And drive other ill health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So high blood pressure is a great example of a socially induced physiological condition which is mediated through our emotions and the impact of our emotions on our autonomic nervous system and on our hormones.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I've never really thought about the term hypertension like that before,
No.
you know, hypertension, and it makes such sense
Yeah.
when we think about it like that. You mentioned this new book you're writing, talking about how we've got is it an insane society around
Yeah.
us?
Yeah.
And I think of stress. You know, as I've mentioned to you, I've just spent a few months locked away writing a new book on stress called The Stress Solution,
Yeah.
and I feel strongly that when we talk about making changes, so a lot of people, when they try and improve their health, they try and improve their lifestyle, okay, which is a pretty reasonable start.
Mm-hmm.
But many people, I find, can't do that, or they do it temporarily for a few weeks, a few days, a few months maybe, but then they revert back. And as a doctor, I've always been intrigued as to why do some patients keep coming back, and why do some patients with the same so-called problem get better with the same course of treatment.
Right.
And I always think, well, if they keep coming back, I'm clearly not getting to the root cause of the problem. And the more I think about your work, although people talk about you in the realm of addiction and trauma, I think your work doesn't only explain addiction and trauma, it explains all human behavior, and therefore has profound implications, not only for trauma, not only for pain, not only for addiction, but actually the whole of the health landscape.
Well, thank you. And again, in my various books I've written about that. It just so happens that it's my addiction book that's being published right now, first in England. When you get down to it, it's very simple. Either you raise human beings whose needs are met, or you raise human beings in a way that you don't meet their needs. When you don't meet people's needs, they have to adapt in artificial ways. Those adaptations become the sources of illness later on. There was a very interesting article in the journal Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, published in January 2012. It was an article on childhood development generated by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. So as prestigious as you get. And in their abstract, they say that human environments that because of scarcity or stress trouble young children cause these children to make adaptations which are psychological and physiological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a long-term cost to health, behavior, and longevity. In other words, the way that young children adapt to stress early on helps them survive that early stress, but in the long term, those same adaptations become sources of pathology. So if you look at my own tuning out, so the tuning out that I did as an infant under conditions of severe psychological strain is an adaptation. It helped me as an infant survive a year where the situation was utterly impossible. But that same tuning out gets programmed into my brain, and now I'm diagnosed with a medical condition, ADHD, decades later. So what was adaptive in one circumstance becomes maladaptive later on. I'm suggesting that much of illness begins with that these are necessary personally adaptations, however, which then stress us later on. And so that there's a real, so what's common to my work is that I look at the sources of adult function or dysfunction in our formative experiences. And, you know, that's not controversial if you look at a gardener. I mean, if a gardener looks at their plants, they know that how they treat that young plant will have a huge impact on the adult plant. Anybody who is in animal husbandry will realize that how you treat the young, whether it's a dog or a horse, will have a huge impact on the personality and behavior of that animal later on. Why don't we get the same thing in human beings? It's the same principle. So it's essentially very simple.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? When you break it down to the like that, it's super simple. We need a society that really supports children and babies and mothers and parents at a young age.
Absolutely.
And then I guess what comes to my mind is, and you may know the stats on this, I don't, but we here in the UK, we always are talking about Scandinavia, and we talk about how they are really prioritizing those early years. You know, they give a lot of maternity leave, a lot of paternity leave. You know, yes, they may have high taxes, but it seems to me that their society there has prioritized family and bringing up children, whereas I don't think we're quite as good here, but I don't think we're as bad as the US. Mm-hmm. A really good friend of mine, he married an American girl, and she, I can't remember, but maybe after she gave birth to her first child, she might have been back at work. It might be something like 4 weeks or something. Yeah. Something obscene, like to me, or it sounds obscene to me.
Absolutely.
And the child's in daycare.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, how society is set up now, and then what that is doing. Because you mentioned your mum's, clearly, that's a huge trauma. I mean, that's hopefully the sort of trauma that most of us aren't experiencing. But are there similarities in terms of what that's doing to the child?
Oh, absolutely. So the United States, which, to hear their politicians, is the best and most glorious country in the world, which itself, by the way, is interesting. Like if you met a person, if your neighbor was always telling you how great he was and how he's the best and everybody wants to be like him, what would you think of him?
Yeah.
You think he's got a grandiose personality disorder and he's compensating for his real sense of deficiency. Well, that's the United States. And they have a lot to compensate for. And what you say about childcare is absolutely true, is that they have a barbaric childcare system, a barbaric maternity leave system, where women, and often poor women on welfare, have to go back to work after a few weeks of giving birth. Now, if you look at human evolution, or look at an ape culture, the ape mothers hold their babies for months. There's no separation. The child actually develops through being held by the mother. And human societies, until very recently, were organized around children being around the parents, really all their lives. Certainly through childhood and adolescence. There was just no separation. What we do in our culture, more in the States than elsewhere, but increasingly elsewhere as well, we separate children from their parents. In other words, we're depriving them from the natural conditions for healthy development. Now, there was a study last year or 2 years ago comparing the crying of British German, Canadian, and Danish children. Lo and behold, Danish kids cried much less than these others. What was the difference? The parents were around, much more. And the parents were much more likely to pick up the kids when they were crying. That's what made the difference. Now, that crying child is an anxious child. When the child is crying, it's not just a benign thing. The child is crying because they're stressed. When they're stressed, their brains are suffused by stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline and cortisol interfere with your physiology, interfere with healthy brain development. So just the fact of holding a child, which was historically and prehistorically the standard, is an essential aspect of child rearing, which modern societies have denied. And as a matter of fact, I don't know what it's like in England, but in North America, we actually advise parents not to pick up their kids. When they're crying at night, we tell them not to pick them up. We sleep train the kid by not picking them up. In other words, we're denying the child's needs for connection.
And what's that doing to the child, do you think?
Well, it does a number of things. One is it gives the child the message that his emotions don't matter. And children take everything personally. It's not true that babies don't have emotions. And it's not true that babies are tabula rasa, where you can write anything you want. Babies have certain defined emotional needs. And when they get the message that they're not important, that's the message they're going to imbibe unconsciously, non-verbally. And you can see that behavior in the adults. You know, the person who comes into your office and says, Doc, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm sure you have many people much more important than me, but I have this little problem. You know what kind of a childhood they had.
Yeah.
Number one, so it gives
that
them
would be me going into the doctor.
Okay.
Or in just various aspects of my life, and the people pleaser.
Yeah.
Always doing, always, yeah, no problem. The amount of times I think just on a social thing, you'd be like, oh, where do you want to go, guys? Yeah, no worries, wherever. You end up somewhere you just don't want to be in. You're in a restaurant you hate the food in, but hey, yeah, it's cool, guys, no problem. And it's, sorry, I don't mean to trivialize what you're saying.
No, you're not trivializing it. What you're actually illustrating, you're telling me exactly what kind of infancy you had.
Yeah. I think one of the first times I came across you was a few years back. I heard you on an interview. So I can't remember what the interview was, but I remember being really impacted by what you said and thinking, who is this guy? I mean, this is pretty incredible what I heard. And it wasn't one of your videos. You were talking a lot about, I think, identity. And I think it was something about, it really got me thinking about, what is my identity? I guess I was on a journey then anyway, since I lost my father about, 7 years ago now. I think that was one of the significant moments in my life that got me to start questioning everything, thinking about, well, who am I? Am I living my life or am I living somebody else's life? I think you expressed it so beautifully, but then when I read your book, I think you start off very early on with identity. So I wonder if you could expand on identity. What is it, and why do you think many of us need to spend a bit of time thinking about it?
Yeah, so I think I know exactly which interview you're talking about and what I say in it. The monks start with identity and at the root of the issue, because a lot of what we experience in the world today, as you know, and I know how holistic you are in the way you advise your patients. When you were speaking on my podcast, I was so impressed by you and how you're able to tie in so many psychological and natural practices and relational exercises that can improve people's health and well-being overall. I remember you talking about encouraging your clients to see more friends as a way of changing the way they feel. And I was thinking, wow, this person's got so many great ideas. And the reason is because, Rangan, you also have that monk mindset of you go to the root of the issue. It's really easy to just say, oh, well, just take 2 of these a day, or try this, or, maybe you need to do this. But when you think about it from the root perspective, where do our challenges arise? And our challenges arise by how we see ourselves. And what I believe Rangan's referring to is there's this quote that I begin my book with and that I've shared in interviews for the last few years. And it's from a writer named Charles Horton Cooley, who wrote this in the 1900s. And what he said is that, I think it's in the 1800s, at the end of the 1800s, towards the 1900s. And he said, and bear with me, and you've got to really listen closely to this. So what he said that the challenge today is, I'm not what I think I am. I'm not what you think I am. I am what I think you think I am. Now, just let that blow your mind for a moment. I will explain it, I promise. I'm not what I think I am. I'm not what you think I am. I am what I think you think I am, which means we live in a perception of ourselves. So I'll break it down. If I think Rangan thinks I'm smart, I'll say I feel smart. But if I think Rangan thinks I'm not smart, then I'll say I'm not smart. And so the challenge is that we're basing how we feel about ourselves on what we think someone thinks of us. And the greatest challenge with that is, how do you have any idea if what you think someone thinks about you is even true, and whether that's even the best place to start? So that's where our identity struggles. We start pursuing things in life because we think other people value them. It's almost like, let's think of the most playground version of this. If I remember wearing high-tech shoes from BHS to the playground, right? I remember my mom, because my parents didn't buy me Nike trainers or Adidas trainers, which I always wanted. You know, we didn't come from that background. I couldn't afford them, and my parents didn't want me to have them. So I'd walk in with my high-tech trainers from BHS. They were about 10 quid or whatever they were. and you know, to me, it didn't make a difference. I didn't really know at that time whether high-tech was good or bad. They were just trainers that my parents bought me. Now, everyone, the cool kid at school, had the latest Nike trainers. All of a sudden, I start thinking that he's now surrounded by everyone. Everyone's talking about his trainers. Everyone's giving him adoration. Everyone's giving him respect. Everyone's talking about his trainers. So now I think that if I want to have that same experience and love from people, that I need to get that. Not realizing that I may be able to get deeper love from people by being kind and compassionate. That I may actually be able to build a real relationship with people if I'm loving and considerate and empathetic. And it's so crazy how your life can become about pursuing something. And that's why Jim Carrey puts it best, and I'm paraphrasing. He says, you know, everyone in the world should achieve everything they've ever wanted and accomplish everything they've ever pursued, just to realize that it's not the point. Now, that doesn't mean the monk mindset is not about not pursuing your goals. It's actually about pursuing your truest goals, your truest self, and your most authentic, aligned goals. So it's not about not having goals. It's about making sure that your goals are actually yours.
Yeah. And, you know, I get shivers when you say that Cooley quote.
Oh, me too, man.
And I think I've had a flashback. I think, I can't say for sure where I was when I heard that interview, but I think I was on a train from Manchester to London, or London back to Manchester. And I think I pressed pause, and I think I wrote it in my notes. I'm pretty sure I wrote it, and I rewound it. I played it again. I thought, hold on, I've got the first part, the second part. What's that third part? And I really had to sit with it for a while. And I would urge people, if they need to, press pause right now, listen to it, and really think about it. And I think, you know, it's really interesting, you know, hearing that. And I reflect on my children, who I know you had a very brief, lovely conversation with just before we started. I might put that in at the end of the podcast.
Please
maybe.
do. It was beautiful.
But I think about this as they go through school, and, you know, they start to see what other people have got. And, you know, my wife and I were very keen to try and not put value on those things, because I know I also had experiences like that when I'd say, oh God, man, they're wearing those things. I want to wear those because if I wear them, I'm going to be happy. I saw maybe a year ago or so, I saw a Gary Vaynerchuk video online when he was telling someone at one of his conferences, he was, you know, he was talking about a BMW, and he basically said to the guy in his inimitable way, which is wonderful, that I think you own a BMW because of what other people will think of you when you drive that BMW. And the guy literally, you know, in that clip, he just sort of sat with it, and he said, yeah, I do. I mean, it's what it symbolized is to people around him. And again, I'm not having to go at anyone who might be doing that. You know, we all do things at times to get that validation, or what we think is a validation from people around them. But I think what you're trying to get at is, how do we find our own identity? How do we live our own lives? So Jay, how do we do that? If we've spent a lifetime living someone else's life, how do we in our 30s or our 20s or our 40s or our 50s, how do we just decide, oh, I'm going to start finding out what my life is?
Yes, absolutely. And I love the tone you're sharing this in, Rangan, because my tone's the same. Like, I'm not coming at this from a point of view of, we're wasting our lives or I've got it figured out. Like I don't want to make this about you not getting your goals or not having pursuits or not wanting to become something, because I want to do all those things too, but it's about why you're doing it. And it's also about making sure they're truly motivated by your inner desire, right? Like that's the point. It's like, if you want to drive a BMW, drive a BMW because that's the car you love. Don't drive it because you think. If you want to be a doctor, become a doctor because you think that's how you're going to serve humanity, not because you think people will be impressed. If you want to go to Harvard or Princeton or Oxford or Cambridge, go there because you really want to study how to solve the world's problems, not because you think it looks good on your resume. Right, that's the point that we're going after. So thank you, Rangan, for like recentering that tonal piece, and I appreciate it. So where do we start? One of my favorite ways to start is looking at what we value. And values are a very intangible word, and so there's a very easy way to figure out what you value. There's two things you have to look at. You look at how you spend your money, the most painful thing you can possibly do. Go through your bank statement and look at where your money is being spent. That is what you value. The other thing that we spend, just like we spend money, is how we spend our time. Those are the two most perfect ways to see what you currently value. Your value isn't what's in your head, isn't what's in your heart, it isn't what's in your mind. It's how you spend your money and how you spend your time. And so, just to give you an overview, and I share this in the book, that research was done on how we spend our time. And the research showed that we spend 33 years in bed, right? 33 years of our life in bed. And 7 years of that is spent trying to sleep, not even sleeping, right? We spend 1 year and 4 months exercising across our whole lives. These are, by the way. We spend more than 3 years on vacation. And we spend a bunch of days trying to get ready. And we spend a bunch of time, standing in lines and queues. And so much of our time just gets spent. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, where am I currently spending my time? And where do I want to spend it? Now, studies also show that everyone has to go to work. So this isn't about what you do for work. People who had more meaningful, purposeful lives and were healthier, wealthier, and wise invested their time in education over entertainment. And Rangan, your audience is lucky because they get education and entertainment in one place. But that's the goal, right? Like that's the goal, that you're creating an opportunity for people to find education. The smartest, the wealthiest, the most healthiest, the wisest people in the world were reading books, watching documentaries, taking courses, listening to podcasts, learning to better themselves. And so that's the first place to start. The second place, when we look at that value audit, is I want you to write down 3 things that you're currently pursuing in life. It might be a promotion, it might be a new home, whatever it is that you are currently pursuing. And then I want you to ask this question: is that your desire and your dream, or is it coming from something outside of you? Is it coming from a pressure of a family member? Is it coming from an expectation because your friend just bought something? Where is that desire truly coming from? And the third and final question you want to ask yourself is, do I still want to pursue that? Or do I want to change how I pursue it? Or do I not want to pursue it at all? And if you go through that 3-step questioning process, you'll get to the truth of what you truly want to pursue and stop yourselves from building a sandcastle which the waves of time will eventually wash away. And so that's what we get lost doing. We get lost building castles that we don't even want to live in.
Yeah. It's so profound. And, I really think that there's something unique about the times in which we live now. There really is this dissatisfaction, this lack of contentment. You put it so beautifully at the start of this conversation. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Minimalism.
I haven't actually, no.
Or not, which I think you'd absolutely love it. I really, really enjoy it. I've seen it a couple of times. I've watched it with my kids again recently. But again, it's these two guys in their 30s who, you know, they've got success by society's definition. They've got the job, they're earning good money, you know, but there's a hole inside. There's a feeling of, is this all there is to life? And so I really think you're tapping on something that is really out there at the moment. And really, if people can get their heads around this, I think it can transform their own lives, but also transform the lives of the people around them, which I think is really, really exciting. Now, you called it a value audit. Now, I thought that word was really interesting because I have been sort of, I had sort of nearly 3 weeks off social media until 2 days ago. Like I didn't post, I went off it, I made a thing of it, and I found that I found it a lot easier to go inward in my life. It was just one thing to switch off a bit of noise for me. That I'm not saying everyone has to do this. It's just something I personally find useful. And I also like to, I think it's a nice example to set to people that you can do it if you want to. But what was really interesting is I've been doing a values exercise with myself. I've been trying to write down 5 core values that I want to live my life by. And it really struck me that a lot of people, and I would probably include myself in this, have got an idea of what we think our values are. But unless we actually go and audit the process of what are we spending our time and money doing, we have no idea if we really are living those values. So I really like the term audit because it's not your perception of how you think you're actually spending your money or spending your time. It's the reality of it. And I think it's something that I haven't done it. And I think I'm going to do it. I think I'm going to actually see, is it aligned with what you say you stand for? Are you actually spending time like that? So is this a common thing, do you think, for people that they have there is a gap between their desired values and their actual values?
I genuinely believe, first of all, Rangan, thank you for sharing that too. And I genuinely believe that people are well-intentioned and want to do good in the world. I believe that. I believe that people have a good heart. They're smarter than we think they are. They want to do good in the world and they want to put out good energy. But you're exactly right that that intention needs to be converted and transferred into real behavior. And this is where you'll find, you'll hear a friend or someone you know say, oh, I really value loyalty and I really don't like gossip. And then you find out that that person was gossiping about you. And how does that feel? It completely feels like someone's broken your trust. And so often the way we see ourselves or want to see ourselves is amplified compared to how we actually behave. So we'll spot something, and there's a beautiful story that I share in the book, and there's lots of these across the book. But there's these old ancient Indian and Zen stories, and there's this story of the evil king that goes to meet a good king. So the evil king goes to the castle, the quarters of the good king, and the good king, being a good king, invites the evil king inside for some dinner. They sit down. The servers bring out the plates. The plates are placed in front of the evil king and the good king, and they're just about to eat. And just about as they're about to eat, the evil king switches the plates. And the good king goes, what's going on? Like, is that some ceremony in your time? Like, look, why are we doing this? And the evil king goes, well, I don't know. You might have poisoned my food. You might be trying to kill me. You might have poisoned it. And the good king just bursts out laughing. He's just like, really? Like, come on. I've invited you over for dinner. Like, this is my team, like, whatever it is, like, let's start eating right now. And just about as he's about to eat, the evil king swaps it back again. And the good king goes, well, now what then? And he goes, well, I don't know, you might be double bluffing me. And that night, the evil king doesn't eat. The good king happily eats his plate. The point is that so often we think we don't have some of the mistakes that we make, but we see them in everyone else. We see those mistakes in other people. So we'll say, oh, this person's not doing this right, or I don't like the way he or she talked to that person. But if we really do an audit in ourselves, we'll realize that we have a lot of those same challenges and feelings that we may think others have. And so for me, it's sometimes a really scary and daunting task to do that values audit, but it truly, truly is a beautiful process that we all need to go through to really realign our map and get our compass right and start moving in the right direction.
I mean, is it the sort of thing that people do once, or is it the sort of thing that people should revisit? And I guess, you know, if I was to ask you, when was the last time you did that exercise on yourself?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say that you have to revisit like gardening. If you look at your garden outside, and I can see a like little glimpse of Rangan's garden. But if you have a garden, how often do you have to garden? Maybe you mow the lawn, I don't know, once a week, once a month. I don't know, you know, whatever you...
Yeah, I'd say once a week, probably. I like a nice, you know, shortish lawn. I don't like it when it gets too long, so...
There you go, once a week. And so I'd say that you have to treat this exercise like gardening, because when you do a values audit, what you're really doing is gardening your values. And what that means is you're pulling out the weeds and you're planting new seeds. That's really the activity that's happening here. You're planting seeds in your mind, values that are good values, that are going to grow into fruits and trees and give shade to others and help other people. Or if you don't garden once a month, let's say Rangan he doesn't bother for the last 6 months during COVID, he just lets it be there. What's going to happen? That garden's going to be full of weeds. It's going to be full of stuff that he doesn't want there, right? It might attract bugs or other things that are there that he doesn't want. And that's what happens with our values, that after a while, our values start to attract dust. They start to attract being covered over by so many other desires. So I would say it's a regular habit. I'd say that I do a refining values and intention exercise on myself about 3 times a week. I used to do it every day, but probably about 3 times a week. And I'm not saying anyone has to do it that often. I do it that often because I feel I live a life that is constantly moving, constantly challenging, and I'm presented with a lot of options and opportunities that I never imagined I'd have. And so I have to really train my mind to focus on these value audits. But I also know that every year I spend 2 or 3 weeks, and I go back to the monastery in India and I spend time in the ashram with monks. And so I feel this is both an activity that happens weekly or monthly. I'd say once a month. I'd say the best way is to treat it like your accounts and your taxes. Look at it every month, look at your bank statement every month. And then once a year, when you have to do your taxes and you're going through that tax return and getting it all right, you kind of do a deep dive on it. So I'd say if everyone could spend 3 days a year, 5 days a year going really deep, and then 1 hour a month, a couple of hours a month, that would be a great way to build it into your practice.
Yeah, now I just want to contrast it with taxes and accounts, which can often be quite tedious and, you know, tear your hair out type exercises for people full of pressure. I would sort of say that the kind of practices that that your book is jam-packed full of practical tools for people. Once you get into this way of thinking, once you start thinking like a monk, these practices become fun. Yeah. Right?
Yes.
And
yeah,
I think,
for sure.
You know, like a lot of, you know, as a doctor, one of the things that frustrates me is that everything around health, well, let's say working out, for example, tends to be around, you know, punishing yourself and pushing yourself and suffering. And so we start to associate things that are good for us as being difficult and as being punishing. But actually, all the tools in your book are going to be good for everyone. They're really going to help people. But I would actually say that they're fun. And if I just speak to my own experience over the last 7 years of really, again, since my dad died, diving into personal growth, not because it was like, oh, dad's not here, now I'm going to do some personal growth. No, it was just in the trauma of dad's death, in the sort of emptiness I felt afterwards. That's where I went. I sort of needed that pain on one level to then get me to start asking questions. But I love the process of getting to know myself better. I love doing these audits. I love trying to figure out my values. I like potentially almost getting addicted to it. Like it feels good. And then you start to, I feel, you start to switch off from the noise around you, and you really start to become tuned in to who you are and what makes you tick.
Learning about ourselves is actually the most fun thing in the world. It's the most enjoyable thing in the world. When you find out about a new way that your mind works and how this value is going to unlock this opportunity in your life. Rangan's spot on. It's such a exciting thing to do. And I would encourage you to make it fun. So I'll tell you an example of some of the fun activities that I love in the book. So one of my favorite ones is I sometimes set myself the challenge of not comparing, not complaining, and not criticizing. And the way I like to do this test is I keep a jar of Post-it notes of every time I compare, complain, or criticize, I'll put it in there. And then I have another jar of every time I'm collaborative, supportive to others, and grateful. And what I love doing is almost doing a competition with myself, because I love being competitive too. I love engaging that in a competition with myself of how often can I make sure. So what you find is the first day you realize, oh no, I complained 10 times today. The second day you're like, oh, I only did 7 times today. And the third day you're like, I only did 4. And the fourth day you're like, oh, only once. And then on the weekend you binge complain again and it all goes up again. But the point is that you make it fun and enjoyable, because what you understand is that you are not your criticism. You are not these negative thoughts. You are not these negative beliefs. They've just become conditioned and habits, just as your garden is not weeds. And what happens is we start thinking that we are our pain. We start thinking that we are stress, right? We say things like, I am just a stressful person, right? I am just a negative person. And the truth is you're not. You're just going through a negative space and time. You're just adopted a negative habit or a negative thought, but you are not a negative person. It's just in the same way as you are not unhealthy. You've just adopted unhealthy habits. And I think when you start making that disconnect between you and the habits you have, you start to realize, oh, if I change the habits, I naturally change.
You might liken modern society to a zoo, where you take an animal from a natural habitat and you put them in a completely artificial, restricted situation, and you expect him to stay as normal as he was out there in the wild. Essentially, that's what's happened to human beings, in that in a very short space of time, in a blink of an eye, from the perspective of evolution, we've gone from the hunter-gatherer, small band, communal, attachment-based group to a society which is alienated, disconnected, and that disconnection is accelerating at a tremendous rate throughout the world. Urbanization, it's taking people out of their villages and into the big cities where they're alone. Here in Britain, there was quite a deliberate assault on community under the Thatcher regime, with the destruction of neighborhoods and communities and so on. And that trend has continued. So what we're having is societies that are less and less natural to the actual makeup of human beings from the evolutionary perspective, and which means that children are being brought up under increasingly artificial and disconnected circumstances. And Johann Hari, who's written a book recently on depression called Lost Connections, is pointing exactly at what's happening in modern society, so that these lost connections characterize the modern world. And as they do, you're getting the spread of autoimmune disease into countries that never used to have it before.
Yeah.
So we think autoimmune disease is one of these, or addictions for that matter. So if you look at the rate of addiction now in countries like China and India, it's going up exponentially, precisely because of the, and it's not a question of idealizing the old way of life.
No.
I mean, we can't go back, and of course there's all kinds of benefits to progress and industrialization. Trouble is that as we progress, we forget the benefits we forget what we've lost. So instead of combining progress, we're trying to hold on to what was best about some of the old ways. We just throw everything out, and we think we can reinvent ourselves. And as we do, we're making ourselves sick.
Yeah. You're right, and I think it's a really great point to sort of bring up. We're not saying we need to go back to hunter-gatherer tribes.
We can't.
Not only should we not, we can't. And there are so many great benefits of the modern world and, as you say, industrialization. I guess it's how do we learn from the past? How do we learn from our evolutionary heritage? And what can we implement from that within the constraints of the modern world? That's how I see it. And you mentioned Johann Hari's new book, and I write a huge quarter of my book on stress is about this, is about relationships and our lack of connection these days. On one level we've been told anyway that we're more connected than we've ever been before, and certainly in a digital sense that may be the case. But when we talk about real human meaningful connection, what I see around me with the public, but what I also see in my practice as a doctor, is I don't think we've ever been this disconnected and lonely. And
well, we're more wired, but we're less connected, is how I would put it. Because genuine connection happens between people, not between pieces of technology. So as you and I are talking to each other, there's a real interaction.
Yeah.
When you speak, I'm looking at you, I'm listening to the modulation of your voice. I may nod in agreement or shake my head in disagreement, vice versa. But the communication is taking place on many different levels. That's a connection. If you and I were having the same conversation online, it'd be a whole different ball game, and I'd have no idea actually who I'm talking to. They'd just be exchanging words. So we're wired together, but we're not actually connected. We're actually disconnected in this world because people are isolated modules sending out messages via the Ethernet or the internet. Yeah. When it comes to addictions, it's that disconnection again that leaves us so alone. So we're traumatized in the first place. We are then develop behaviors that soothe our pain, but which actually keeps us more isolated from other people, because we're ashamed of ourselves and we hide it, and we furtively seek out our addictive pleasures. And that disconnection then furthers our sense of isolation. That isolation furthers our pain, and that pain further drives our addiction. So we live in a society that actually generates addiction in many of its members.
Yeah, it really does, doesn't it? I did a post on my social media channels, I think just yesterday actually, about friendship. And I was saying that, look, seeing your friends in real life, so not over the internet, in real life is a necessity for human health, not a luxury. And I know myself, I've neglected some of the friendships closest to me over the last few years because I've been busy with my career and my family. And so, and you sort of see on social media what your friends are doing, so you feel less of a need to actually see them in real life. And I was really surprised with how much that post on social media resonated with people. Yeah. So many people started interacting and saying, yeah, you know what, I've not seen my friends in months. Yes, I've maybe had a bit of a text conversation with them, but I'm not seeing them in real life. And this was me trying to sort of challenge everyone to say, hey, look, get a date in the diary now, even if it's in 2 months' time, with one of your friends. Email them, call them, text them, whatever, but put a date in the diary where you're going to see your friends in real life. And it's crazy, isn't it, that we need to say these things. I mean, these things have always been there in human culture, yet we're now having to talk about them and remind us what has just been our norm for so many millions of years.
And what's interesting, of course, is that on Facebook, we use the same language as we would in real life. So on Facebook, people have friends. But these friends that we have, these are people we don't know. We have nothing necessarily in common with, except maybe certain cultural ideas or interests. And so these friendships aren't genuinely supportive relationships. They're pseudo-friendships. And we actually substitute the one for the other. And then on Facebook, people like each other, but which are, again, is a substitute for genuine contact. But it's not that they like each other, they don't even know each other. You don't know somebody until you hung out with them. And so we substitute the language of friendship, and we substitute the language of connection for genuine friendship and genuine connection. And then we wonder why we feel so lonely and why we're so dissatisfied.
And why we are seeking pleasure or seeking to numb that discomfort with the choices we're making, whether it is heroin, cocaine, or shopping and sugar.
Yeah.
Because I guess, a lot of people listen to my podcast are trying to make lifestyle change. And a lot of them feel inspired to do so by what they hear, but some of them, I know, are struggling.
Well, I'm very interested in language, and even the phrase lifestyle change. It's not lifestyle changes people need to make, it's life changes people need to make.
Yeah.
You can change the style, but style is a rather superficial thing. You know, the style of clothing, you know. It's the life changes that people need, and we need to help people see the life changes that are required, not the lifestyle changes they need to require. It's the fundamental life that's being lived that needs to change, not the external behaviors. And lifestyle largely refers to behaviors, but not necessarily a transformation within. And really, to deal with addiction, it's not a question of dealing with the lifestyle, it's a question of dealing with the life. And it's a question of really owning the life, that this is my life, and I'm the one who needs to be the agent of my own life. And here are the reasons why the wound, or the trauma is another word for wound, actually. So the wounding that I received as a child has had me behave in certain ways. It's not those behaviors I need to change. I need to heal that wound. I need to change my life. And then the life behavior changes will automatically follow.
Yeah, you really got me thinking about language, actually, because two terms that I use very commonly in my work, whether it's hypertension or lifestyle, you've just, in seconds, reframed what those words actually mean. And I wonder where that comes from. You're an immigrant to North America. Where has this fascination with language come from?
Well, I think as an immigrant, you get to see the language a bit more clearly than the people who are actually in it. And you get to see the construction of language. And by the way, in my secret life, I used to be an English teacher. So I did that before I went to medical school. So I've always paid a lot of attention to language. And language very often unconsciously expresses realities and truths that when you pay attention to it are revealing. Yeah. And so words should never, even the word addict. Now, the word addiction actually comes from a Latin phrase for slavery.
Wow.
So
a slave to the pain.
Well, the original meaning was an addictus. It comes from the word to assign. Now, in the Roman world, when you couldn't pay a debt, you would be assigned as a slave to somebody until you worked off the debt. So you'd be an addictus. Somebody was assigned to somebody. So that's the origin of the word. So it implies slavery. So we actually understand that addict refers or originates in the word for slavery. We realize that it's not a choice, because who would ever choose to be a slave? So I think language is absolutely revelatory if you understand the sources and meanings of words.
Yeah, very much so. Gabor, I want to go to something you did last night in your talk, which I went out for dinner with my friends afterwards. We all attended it, and we were all talking about it. Which was you peppered throughout the evening. You said, if there is anyone in here who feels they have some form of addiction without childhood trauma, and you're happy to talk about it, please raise your hand. And at the end, you actually found someone who quite confidently put their hand up and was pretty nonchalant that they had a happy childhood. And so you started inquiring into her childhood, and I remember the tone of her voice initially was very much, you said, you have a happy childhood. Yes, happy childhood. Parents said, yeah, parents absolutely love me. Really sort of very vocal about how great her childhood was. And then it wasn't long before it became clear that actually she felt that her parents really loved each other, and sometimes she was intruding on them.
That's right.
And I think it was really powerful for the whole audience of 300 to see how we all potentially tell ourselves a certain narrative, stories that we continue telling ourselves. And, she obviously maybe is a fan of your work. She's come here, she's come to watch you speak, but hadn't reflected on her own experience. And I wonder, what's going on there?
So what's happened here is that this woman says she had this happy childhood, but within a couple of minutes, and my mantra is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And so I always say that there's pain underneath it. And I said to the audience, it never takes me more than 3 minutes to drill down to where the pain is. You just have to ask the right questions. So
and I've got to say, about a minute in, I thought, maybe this is the first one who Gabor won't get to.
Yeah.
I actually thought, because she was so confident in her answers. So anyway, please continue.
Well, that confidence itself is a giveaway.
Yeah.
because it's an assumed stance to protect herself from the pain that she doesn't want to feel or she's afraid to feel. So she said, well, maybe I felt I was intruding on my parents. And in other words, really what she felt was that she wasn't accepted and loved for who she was. And when she felt unhappy, there was nobody for her to be talk to. And all you have to do is ask that person, if your own child did the same thing, how would you understand it? And they totally get it. So what's going on there? She's not lying.
No.
But believing that she had a happy childhood was her way of dealing with her pain. Because if she dropped that idea, she'd have to realize that she suffered, and she actually, as much as her parents did their best and loved her, we're not blaming the parents, but she herself got the impression that she was alone and unsupported and unloved for who she was. Now that's very painful.
Yeah.
So we defend against the pain by suppressing those emotions and developing this ideology of the happy childhood. And so that's just another form of self-defense. And then, given her ideology that she had a happy childhood, she can't understand why she turned to an addiction. But once she gets that, yeah, okay, that belief that I was happy denies the fact that I was feeling isolated and alone, and I felt myself as an intrusion on my parents.
Yeah.
Now she can understand what her pain was. But not feeling that pain was how she survived her childhood, because as a child, how would she survive if she believed that she wasn't loved for who she was? Life would be intolerable for her. So she has to deny and suppress that.
So she had an appropriate response to the signals that were given to her.
That's exactly what you said before, and that's exactly what happened with her. So that suppression of her pain and denial of it is a completely appropriate defensive response.
Yeah.
These are not mistakes that we make. These are essential survival adaptations. The problem is, then we spend because we learned how to ignore our feelings as children, now we learn to ignore them for the rest of our lives, and that then creates problems for us. So again, it's that whole idea of an early adaptation, essential adaptation, brilliant adaptation, but because it's unconscious, it stays with us, and now it limits our lives. So we become imprisoned with our own adaptations. Our childhood patterns become the prison through which we live our lives.
So hopefully last night for her might have been a key step, potentially, in her now being able to really go out and seek real healing, transformative healing. Hopefully, touch wood.
Touch wood. But I would say that the very fact that she came to the talk and the very fact that she raised her hand, she was already working at it.
Yeah.
Because she didn't have to raise her hand.
Yeah.
So if she did, it meant that she already had a curiosity about it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So she'd already taken the first step.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, in your book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, I think, is it the second chapter where you talk about a funeral you go to of one of your, someone you were looking after, an addict.
A 35-year-old who overdosed, yeah.
And I will let you tell the story, but one thing it really illustrates to me is how addiction is on a spectrum, of course, but how powerful that addictive drive is for some people, and I just wonder if you could expand on that, because that was really, really interesting.
So this woman's real name was Shannon, which I can tell now. She was 35, and she was a beautiful woman as a young woman. When I met her, she was already fading. She was in her mid-30s or early 30s when I met her. She had severe opiate addiction, and because she injected, she had blood-borne infection in one of her knees. So she had osteomyelitis, a joint infection, or a bone infection in her knee bones. She needed to be hospitalized for intravenous antibiotic care, but she could never be hospitalized long enough because she had to leave and use. And every time she left and used, she was expelled from the hospital. Right. So her osteomyelitis was never treated.
Expelled from the hospital?
Expelled from the hospital because she
wasn't engaging in treatment?
Well, she was leaving the hospital to use.
Right.
And
so therefore they wouldn't treat her?
So she wouldn't, so they didn't want her using her IV lines for shooting heroin. No. Since then, we've developed a facility where people can have intravenous antibiotics and use if they need to. But this is before the days of that particular facility.
Yeah.
So out of the regular hospitals, she'd be regularly kicked out. before her 6 or 8 weeks of antibiotics treatment was completed. So by the mid-30s, and they were actually talking about amputating the knee because there's nothing more they could do. And so by her mid-30s, she was in a wheelchair, and she would quickly wheel her wheelchair down a street looking for her next hit. Now, she left the downtown east side for 6 months, and she actually got clean. And then she came back, and within 3 days was dead of an overdose. Because what happened, of course, is that she used the same amount she had used before she left the downtown east side, but now she was detoxed. So she'd lost her tolerance. So you would understand what I mean by that.
Yeah.
So the same dose that she could tolerate prior to leaving the downtown east side, now that she was free of drugs, that same dose killed her.
Wow.
And so we go to her funeral, and there's all these friends of hers, each of them with their HIV or their hepatitis C or their chronic infections, and they're mourning their friend.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking how powerful the drive of the addiction is, that this young woman would shed her life for the sake of that next hit, and her friends who are watching her being buried and memorialized are going to continue using despite this dire example.
Yeah, they're going to continue using despite seeing that.
Yeah.
Just seeing that wasn't enough to go, right, we're going to change our behavior now.
And which is why anybody who thinks this is a choice is out of their minds. Nobody would choose to blight and endanger their lives like that. And so this is what made me thinking, well, what is this powerful drive? I mean, it must be really deeply built in to the human brain and the human soul for people to engage in this behavior despite all this deterrence that they witness around them. And so what made that event powerful for me was the starkness of the experience of these people and the social idea that somehow this is any kind of a choice.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it's incredible to hear that, actually. And certainly me and maybe all the listeners, on some level in their lives may know, maybe not to the same degree as that, but may know what that drive feels like when you know you shouldn't be doing something, but you choose to do it nonetheless.
Well, I know that. I mean, I've had that in my own life. And there's something in you that knows you shouldn't be doing it. It's almost, recently I became aware of a form of therapy called internal family systems.
Oh my God, that's what I'm doing at the moment.
IFS.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Dick Schwartz's stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had 2 or 3 sessions and it's been brilliant for me so far.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So I met the founder of it recently. We become good friends, and but I've learned the technique to some degree. I'm not an official practitioner of it, but I'm quick to catch on. So in internal family systems, you realize there's these different parts of you, and these different parts form like a squabbling family. Some of them like each other, some of them don't like each other. So there's a part of me that can watch the other part doing its thing, knowing that he shouldn't be doing it, but feels quite helpless to intervene. So I watch myself. Like, for example, when I am supposed to be working, looking after clients, but instead I watch myself go to the store to engage in my shopping addiction. I'm not unaware of what's happening. There's a part of me that's watching it, disapproving of it, wanting me not to do it. But that part is not strong enough to assert itself. The part that's driving the behavior is driving the boat.
Yeah.
And so it's a question of becoming friendly with all these parts, finding out what is it they really want, what are they after, and the part that's driving me to do the shopping when I should be looking after my patients.
Yeah.
Is a part that really is desperate for me to feel good for a moment. That's all it wants. It just wants me to be happy. It's not an evil part. It just wants me to be happy. And it's not a question of indulging it, but it's a question of really getting to know it.
And understanding it.
Understanding it and actually being compassionate with it. And then teaching it, you know what, it's okay, but this guy can be happy without indulging in that behavior.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to do that. You may think he does, but he doesn't.
I think compassion is something that's coming up quite a lot, isn't it? As a society, how do we deal with addiction no matter what it is, instead of locking people up
Yeah.
because we've deemed them to have a illegal addiction.
Yeah.
We should be treating them with compassion, but we should also be treating ourselves with compassion, I think, and not beating ourselves up over the choices we make, because often, they're just a protective mechanism.
Well, so you mentioned a number of times the question of the arbitrariness of the which drugs we choose to illegalize. As physicians, you tell me if you disagree with me, but give me 1,000 people who smoke heavily every day, a pack a day. Give me another 1,000 who drink heavily every day. Give me 1,000 who smoke cannabis every day, and give me 1,000 who shoot heroin 4 times a day in a dose that doesn't create an overdose. At the end of 30 years, in which groups are we going to see more disease and death amongst those 4 groups?
Alcohol, probably.
Alcohol and the smoking, the cigarette
Yeah.
smoking, by far. By far. These are far more lethal drugs than the heroin and the cannabis.
But
is
they're
not.
okay, aren't they? They're legal.
Yeah, no, heroin, it's true. If you overdose, it'll kill you. But I'm talking about in doses.
Yeah.
Many of the overdoses happen because people are having to shoot up in back alleys with who knows what impurities. What if we gave them their heroin in as they do in some clinics in the UK, at least they used to, in prescribed doses that keeps them from going into withdrawal,
Yeah.
but doesn't overdose them? That group will be far healthier 30 years later. So by what arbitrary standard have we decided that it's okay for people to murder themselves with cigarettes and alcohol, but they can't use heroin legally? What logic is behind that? It has nothing to do with medicine, for sure. It has nothing to do with health.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we should sell heroin in the streets. I'm talking about the illegalization and the criminalization and the ostracization. Why is that drug addict more reprehensible than the person who smokes cigarettes?
Yeah.
Where do we get these ideas from?
It's the why, not the what.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And really, I mean, we were talking about this before we started recording, but we're both on one level, we are both just GPs. We're just family physicians.
Well, the word "just" has another meaning.
What does it mean?
We're very just people. We're interested in justice.
Yeah, I like it. But what I find really interesting, and it's something I talk about quite a lot, is I think we've certainly overvalued the specialist within medicine for far too long, and really undervalued the role of the generalist. And I am very proud to be an expert generalist. And one of the reasons I moved from specialism into general practice, which was a rather unusual decision for many, and certainly my father, who was an immigrant to the UK, and was really shocked as to why his son would do that, qualify as a specialist, and then move to generalism.
And it was a demotion in his mind.
Yeah, I think he was just confused.
Yeah.
And I understand that, and I think the doctors of the future, the healthcare practitioners of the future who are going to have the best outcome with their patients are the ones who are expert generalists and can see everything. And I know we're running short on time, so we will hopefully continue this at another time because there's so much to talk about. But I do find interesting that you're one of the world's leading voices on trauma and addiction, and you're a family practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what you do with your patients, you have intuitively picked up, and you've also got a skill at, I think maybe the word counselling is the wrong word. You do a lot of emotional work with your patients.
Yeah.
And I'm finding the more I understand about the human body and the more I really understand what's driving my patients' behavior, I'm doing a lot of emotional work with them. And yes, of course, referring them to an appropriate practitioner where it's needed, where someone's got that expertise. But that wasn't my job. I didn't train to do that, but I figured out, as someone who's really inquisitive as to how can I get my patient better, I find, I have to go there because it's really important.
Well, so I think you and I are both properly and dramatically impressed by the capacities and skills of our various specialist colleagues.
Absolutely.
It's amazing what they can do. So this is without any sense of diminishing or devaluing their work.
Of course.
But they're trained in a certain ideology, which is purely biologically based. So they look upon the human body as a physiological entity divided into various organs and systems. And that's what they deal with. And what they're not taught is that human beings, the mind and the body, the emotions and the physiology are inseparable, scientifically inseparable, and we have the science to show the unity. They're also not taught that human beings are social creatures, so that our very physiology is shaped by our social relationships. And our very brains develop in a social context, so that whether we talk about neurophysiology, psychology, or the physiology of the body, we're talking about influences that go well beyond our genetic and physiological endowment. They're not taught that. And therefore, when they see a person, what they see is a disease in a particular organ. Whereas if you're a generalist, properly trained, or at least a generalist who's developed a broader view, you see that human being in context, you see it in a relationship to their lives, in a relationship to their environment, and you see that the illness, whether it's addiction or depression or anxiety, or for that matter, rheumatoid arthritis or scleroderma or anything else, is a manifestation not just of a system, but of an entire life. And that life is lived in a context. And we have to address that if we're going to deal with the illness. And unfortunately, both you and I have had the experience of having to come to that conclusion through our own work and through our own internal experience of dissatisfaction with how our lives are going. But nobody taught this to us.
Yeah.
And yet this is the way that so the average medical student, despite all the trauma that you and I have discussed today, particularly in relationship to addiction, and all the research showing how the addicted brain develops in response to the environment, and how the addiction itself is a response to the environment, the average medical student in North America, and I would argue probably in Britain, doesn't even hear the word trauma once in 4 years of medical school. I mean, did you hear the word trauma when you went to school?
I don't think I heard it till a few years ago, frankly.
Yeah,
Let's alone at medical school.
And it's not a word that they should hear. It's a course they should have. Every physician should be deeply trained in trauma, because everything they see, virtually everything they see, has got a traumatic connection to it, particularly in the mental health field. But I would say in the physical health field as well. They don't even hear the word.
Yeah.
So essentially, when a person goes to a physician, they go to somebody with very deep but very limited knowledge, who does not see the whole individual, who's not trained to see the whole individual.
Even the fact that we say physical health and mental health as two separate things is almost a reflection of that in many ways.
That's right.
Because they're not different, are they?
And again, I heard world health is interesting, because what's the origin of the world health? It's wholeness.
Wholeness.
So to talk about physical health is already a contradiction. Because you can't talk about physical wholeness. Wholeness means everything.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love it thinking about it like that. Look, Gabor, for many people listening, we've gone through some quite dark stuff, hopefully illuminating for people, but potentially dark and quite demoralizing potentially for some people in terms of them thinking about their own lives, potentially what they might have inadvertently passed on to their own children. I know certainly the first time I saw you speak, you automatically start to think about your own ability as a father and what you could have potentially done better, all the time remembering that you've done the best that you can at that time. I wonder if we can finish off with a few notes of positivity for people, that there is hope and there are things that we can do to help change this. Well,
first of all, I don't see this as a gloomy discussion, because I think for people to understand themselves, they need to look at all aspects of their existence. So to me, this is illuminating. And St. Paul says somewhere that once you shed light into darkness, the darkness itself becomes light. And so that I just think we have to look at all these dark places. We have to shed light into all of them so we can fully understand ourselves. To me, that's a positive. I'm always delighted to find out something about myself that maybe I haven't seen so clearly before. I always find it liberating, and I believe people do as well. Number one. Number two, what we haven't said, though, and I think probably both you and I would agree, is that the human beings have a tremendous healing capacity. And one of the failures of modern medical training is that we put all the expertise and the hope for help into the hands of the physician. The physician is the one who's going to deliver the cure, but we don't teach people about the innate healing capacity of the human being, and we don't learn how do you promote that healing capacity. We may have to administer whatever treatments are appropriate and whatever genius treatments we've developed.
Sure.
That's great, but nevertheless, that person still has an innate healing capacity. How do we engage it? How do we evoke it? How do we encourage it? That's not a question that we ask ourselves, and yet there's many examples of people healing or doing much better with illnesses than medical prognosis would have told them. Now look at the recent death of Stephen Hawking, the physicist, who I discuss in one of my books. Now he was given 2 years to live when he was 20 years old. He outlived his diagnosis by more than 5 decades. Something in him allowed him to do that. Something in him that the medical mind could not have fathomed at the time. So there's much more to people than we realize. And so we have to have a lot more faith and a lot more curiosity. What is it in people that allows them to overcome the challenge of addiction? What is it that helps them live much longer than we had predicted? What is healing? What is becoming whole really all about? These are the questions that medicine ought to engage with, but unfortunately it does not. So I think your work and your podcast and your books are, if as I understand them, and the same thing with me, are designed to help people find within themselves that which can empower them to support their own healing.
Yeah.
And we can't say that strongly enough.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for that, Gabor. For people who are listening, who, maybe something you've said has really deeply struck a chord with them about their own life, and they want to go on that journey but don't know how. Have you got any words of advice as to how they can start, even listening to this and start to be aware, of course, is a very critical first step, but where can they go next?
Well, so you and I are both authors, and I would highly recommend they check out our books first, because I think, and in my case, I hope they check out my books, because
Of course.
there's a lot of what I know and what I've learned that I've poured into my books. And a lot of people find a lot of self-knowledge just by seeing the mirror that's held up in my writings or in my multiple YouTube talks, for example. Now, where to go in their own lives? I actually think that once people start asking these questions, they find the answers in their own lives. In other words, there's an old saying that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And I think there's many modalities of healing that are practiced here in Britain, anywhere else in the world, that once you start seeing the limitations without rejecting the value, but seeing at the same time the limitations of mainstream medicine, start looking outside it a little bit, or start finding practitioners within mainstream medicine that have a broader view. In other words, go where the help is, and don't assume that because somebody's got a degree after their name that they know everything that needs to be known. In other words, become the agent in your own healing. Once people take that on, generally they find help. I find. I can't give them a specific go-to, except that once you start asking the right questions, the answers will start coming.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this conversation, there's loads more like it on my channel. Please do press subscribe and hit that bell. Now, back to the conversation. You mentioned gratitude, and gratitude has come up on the show before, but what I loved about your take on it was, if I remember the chapter rightly, you said, gratitude is a daily practice. That's the easy part. I want you to be grateful in every aspect of your life. And I love that. And I've been sitting with that idea for the last week or so. What if you could expand on it, Jay?
Yeah, beautiful. I'm really glad you're asking me about gratitude. Before we do that, though, you sparked another thought. Do you mind if I kind of go back, if you're okay with it?
Go where you want to go, man.
You're sparking so many great thoughts in my mind. I can't ignore them. You're such a great interview. It's so much fun. Like, I really feel like we've gone in so many directions that I didn't even plan. So thank you so much. But when you were talking about the stories we tell ourselves, I think that's so important, because there's a great study that I talk about in the book by Amy Wrzniewski from the Yale University. And what they found is that they tried to find a career that they felt people may find not sharing a positive story around. And they found that hospital cleaners or hospital workers potentially have one of the toughest jobs. And Rangan, you're a doctor, and I'm sure you've seen people having to do that work, and it's a tough job. And so they asked hospital workers how they defined their jobs. And the majority of them defined it as low skilled, defined it as, insignificant, defined it as just a way to pay the bills, and that their job wasn't useful or their job wasn't important. And their role was basically described like the personnel manual. But then they asked another set of hospital workers, the same people who did the same jobs, different people who did the same jobs. And they said, how do you feel about your jobs? And these people had completely different views. They felt they were healers. They felt they were caretakers. They felt that they were able to transform the energy of the actual hospital. They felt that they were carers for the people there. And what they found is that these different people who did the same job were telling themselves a different story. And therefore they saw their role as integral to the healing of the patient. And because they saw their role as integral to the healing of the patient, they found the work that they did to be extremely meaningful. And that's crazy to think about it, that different people doing the same job could say different things about the same work. They're doing the same exact thing daily, but someone thinks it's meaningless and the other thinks it's so meaningful. And this was a term by Yale that was called job crafting. The ability to assign meaning where you see it, and all of a sudden your life becomes meaningful. So if you're sitting in a job right now that you hate, or if you've got a boss that you really don't like, or if you're in a relationship that you don't want to be in, if you can't leave for whatever reason right now because of COVID or lockdown or whatever it is, financial difficulties, if you can't leave and you really want to, one of the things I recommend you do is called job crafting from the Yale School of Management. That you start asking yourself, where can I find meaning in this? What can I learn? What can I adopt? What is this trying to teach me? And that's actually where gratitude can be applied to every place, because you start going, there is some value in this. I remember when I wanted to leave my corporate job and I wanted to live my passion and do what I do today. But I'm so grateful I was at my corporate job because I learned so much there that is so useful to me now. And we find it very easy to be grateful when things are going our way, but we find it very difficult to be grateful when things are not going our way. But what we have to learn to realize, which is a really hard lesson to realize, is that things are always going your way if you're moving in the right direction. Things are not going to always look like they're going your way, and they could still be going your way. We've all seen curses turn into gifts and gifts turn into curses. But the problem is, Rangan, and this is the challenge, we have a projector up here of what we want life to look like. And then we have the reality of what life actually looks like. So there's this big discrepancy. And so sometimes you're actually going in the right direction, but because it doesn't look like your picture and your image of what it should look like, you work less, you become lazier, you become complacent, you try less harder because you're like, this doesn't look like the right direction. But you'll get to where you want in life, just not in the way you imagined it, if you keep going, if you keep pushing, if you keep learning. And that's what it means to be grateful in all areas of your life, is trying to, even in the toughest moment, even in a challenging situation, not gratitude like, oh, I'm so thankful to you for causing me the pain. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is saying to yourself, where is there meaning in this? Where is the lesson in this so I don't repeat this again? If I can be grateful in this challenging situation and I can experience gratitude at all times, then I'm always going to be coming at things from a positive space and positive energy.
Yeah, so powerful, Jay. Would you recommend people start off with a particular daily practice as a way of getting good and developing the skill before they can start applying it, let's say, to aspects of their life that maybe aren't going as well as they want to, where they have to reframe things? I mean, what has been your experience in trying to teach people about gratitude and how they should start that process?
Yeah, so you always develop your muscles in the training center and in the gym. You don't go out and develop your muscles on game day, right? Like no one gets thrown out onto the pitch and says, oh yeah, go and play a World Cup final and you'll figure out how strong you are. You would never do that. You train in the gym, you prepare, you get ready, and then you go. You don't go, I want to learn how to run. Maybe I should run in the marathon next year, right? That's not how it works. And so Rangan's absolutely right that it starts in small bouts. So I want to get more practical because me and Rangan have spoken about a lot of concepts today. when we talk about practicing thankfulness or gratitude, and I talk about 4 habits in the book, one of them, one of the key daily habits or daily practices is thankfulness. Now, thankfulness isn't just about feeling. Thankfulness isn't just about thinking. It's actually about expressing. So when Rangan messaged me a few weeks back and he told me that he'd been reading my book, I sent him an early copy because he was going to interview me on the podcast, and he sent me that message. I was so grateful to him, like genuinely, because he was expressing gratitude to me. And that's the amazing thing. Instead of just feeling gratitude, let's say Rangan felt it, but he didn't say it to me. If he didn't say it to me, he would have not had the experience, A, of sharing it, B, of receiving my gratitude back to him and our relationship deepening based on that simple message he sent me. And so gratitude becomes more powerful when you express it daily. So every day ask yourself, who's a person that you want to express gratitude to and go and tell them? Secondly, what's a place that you're grateful for and spend more time in that place? And what's a project that you're grateful for in your life? And if you write these down every single day before you go to bed, who's a person I'm grateful for and why? What's a place that I'm grateful for and why? And right now, it may not be a place you can go to. It may be a place that you visited and you're so grateful you got to go there before COVID. And the third thing is a project in your life. And so when you express gratitude, make sure that it's specific. So I'll give you an example. Let's say Rangan throws a party with his wife this weekend at their home and their friends come over. And one of his friends, Rangan, give me 2 friends' names in your life and we'll pick on them for a bit.
Okay. I'll say Jeremy.
Jeremy.
'Cause I know he'll be listening.
Yeah.
You know what? I'll go Gareth.
Okay,
my buddy
Gareth and Jeremy.
Really,
Gareth,
yeah.
So let's say Gareth and Jeremy, and again, I'm just going to add a disclaimer. None of this reflects Gareth and Jeremy in real life. But let's say Gareth and Jamie come to this party that Rangan and his wife throw, and it's just, just a gathering to get people together. The next morning, Rangan wakes up. He doesn't look at his first thing in the morning, his phone. That's not what Rangan does. Rangan looks at his phone about 3 hours later, after he's exercised, meditated, spent time with his kids. And then he looks at his phone, and he sees these 2 messages from Gareth and Jeremy. Gareth, sorry about this, but here we go. So Gareth has messaged him saying, thanks, mate. It was great, right? That was Gareth's message. And Jeremy's message was, Rangan, thank you so much. Like, you and your wife just threw an amazing party, and I loved all the games we played. Your kids are adorable. And oh, by the way, you know that food? How did you both make that? The food was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for letting us have this moment together. So those are 2 messages. A or B, which one do you think causes Rangan more joy? Now, Rangan's a grateful person, so he'll be grateful to both of them. But he's more likely, and honestly, all of us are, going to be more grateful to Jeremy in that scenario because he's gone into more depth and been specific about what he actually liked and learned. And because of that, he's now going to attract more love and gratitude back from Rangan as well. So that's why expressing gratitude is actually the key. And if we can express gratitude to people, places, and projects, we start to develop more gratitude in our life. And that's something we can do daily. And it can be an email, it can be a voice note, it can be a text, it could be a video call, but it can be as simple as just a text message. But specific gratitude is scientifically shown to be better for you and better for the other person.
Yeah, I mean, Jay, thanks so much for sharing that because, gratitude gets spoken about a lot these days, but I think that specificity piece, I think that example beautifully demonstrates I can feel it, the difference. You can feel it viscerally as you hear it. It does something different. And I remember so clearly, I think I left you a WhatsApp voice message because I was thinking, he's probably asleep now, but he won't have his phone on at night. There's that bit of insecurity at first. And I thought, no, just express the damn gratitude. I think the Rangan of a few years ago possibly wouldn't have done it out of insecurity or will this be taken the right way or the wrong way or whatever. But I would say the person I am today, having done a lot of the work and having practiced a lot of these tools, there is if not only as you're sharing, does it feel good for you to get it, but it feels nice to share it. I'm doing a lot of voice notes these days. I'm finding I'm going into WhatsApp, pressing the the mic. In fact, someone told me during lockdown that you can actually press it and flip it up, which is my friend Jody. Thanks, Jody. I didn't know you could do that because then you can talk without actually holding it.
I didn't know that either. I hold it down. Thank you, Jody. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's actually Jeremy's wife. So it's all coming. It's bringing it back together for those guys. But I find it's really. So I'm a vocal kind of person. I like talking, and sometimes I find it hard to express what I want to on a text message. So I'll just do a WhatsApp voice message. And I think gratitude is super powerful. One thing I'm going to add, well, I'll ask you actually, do you do your gratitude practice by yourself, or do you also do it with your wife?
So I do my gratitude practice by myself, but then the expression may lead to me expressing it to my wife if she's the person that day that I'm being grateful for. And now I'm probably grateful to my wife every day. And so I express gratitude to her every day. But I really find spending some time by myself to figure out my mind first. It's almost like if you're both trying to solve a problem together, you can help each other. But one person can sometimes take shortcuts because the other person kind of carries the weight. And it's really important to really be clear about who you're grateful for. You can do it with your partner, of course, but make sure one of you are not kind of relying on the other person to come up with all the answers and do all the hard work when it really needs to be a personal feeling. So, for me, I feel gratitude is the easiest gift you can give someone and the easiest gift for someone to receive, especially when it's genuine and specific. And Rangan, I would encourage you, not just with me, but with anyone, it was so genuine and specific that, I recommend you continue to do that. Sharing of gratitude, as you saw, and you said it's visceral. It is. It boosts your mood when you're grateful to someone in a specific way, and then you feel their love back.
Do you feel, or do you think, as I do, that many people have got hang-ups and insecurities, and therefore to do what I did, to actually express gratitude to someone, they're fearful about doing it?
Yeah.
Because insecurity is, I think we all face insecurities, right?
Yeah.
And how would you help someone who says, hey, Jay, look, I want to do that. Like, I'd love to tell my work colleague that, she was so helpful to me yesterday and she got me out of this jam and helped me do something. But you know what, will it come across wrong? I don't really know. What will they think? I mean, what would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, I think you are right. I think some of our insecurity sometimes our insecurity can come from our ego, which is blocking our gratitude. So the ego says, well, I don't want to recognize that someone else is doing something good because it makes me feel inferior. That's one of the ways that our ego can block us from gratitude. And I believe in some traditions and in some circles, I've heard ego being translated to eliminate gratitude out, right? It's like eliminate ego. So, you can kind of lose gratitude through ego because you think, if I tell them that they're good, then that means I'm not good, which is not true at all. The other way the insecurity comes in gratitude is like, what if they think I'm just trying to like get close to them, or I'm just trying to say something nice for the sake of it, or I'm just lying or pretending. Like, what if they think I'm just trying to suck up to them, right? Like, is that the reason? And so sometimes we hold back how we feel. What I'd say to you is, I'd say that expressing gratitude, if genuine, if from the heart, and if well explained and thought out, should always be shared even when you feel uncomfortable. Because when it's shared from that place, you've already got the benefits of feeling grateful. And then if that person does or doesn't react in the way you expect them to, and by the way, there shouldn't be a need for them to react because you're just thanking them for what they've already done. You're not thanking them for what they're about to do. You're thanking them for what they've already done. So now if they respond in an ungrateful way, you haven't lost your gratitude because you're grateful for what they did in the past, not what they did in the future. So don't then go, they didn't even deserve me to be grateful, because they did for that moment of what they did for you. So share it because it's good for you. Don't worry about how they respond.
Yeah. And I guess also if they do respond in that way, or if they do think that, that's their own issue, right?
Yeah. Yeah, completely.
That's not your issue. That you've expressed it from your heart. How they react is kind of out of your control, right? And that's another key learning, I think, on this path to thinking like a monk, I would guess, is, you're not in control of other people's thoughts, right?
Not at all. And that's, that's the biggest lesson, is that you're not in charge of the results how people respond or what they think. You never are. So wasting your time trying to change how someone thinks of you can actually be one of the most worthless pursuits in life. But changing how you think about yourself is probably one of the most worthwhile pursuits in life, but the one we spend less time on. We're constantly trying to change how people think about us. And we think if they think highly of us, then we'll feel better about ourselves. But that's not the case. The case is we can change how we feel about ourselves by changing our behavior and being more in aligned with the person we want to be with our values, as Rangan said, going back full circle. So don't get lost in trying to change other people's perceptions of you, because that could be a never-ending journey and a journey that you never reach the destination of, because you never will truly be able to control it.
Yeah. Comes full circle back to that Cooley quote, right? Yeah. I mean, it is such a powerful quote, because everything we talk about, you can then just back it up straight into that, and again, it brings out the meaning of that quote so much more. Yeah. But Jay, when you were just talking there about the insecurity that some people may feel when trying to express gratitude, I was struck by something I wrote down from your book, and I can't remember which chapter it's in, but you say it's impossible to build one's own happiness on the unhappiness of others.
Yeah, so I'm quoting Daisaku Ikeda, who's a Buddhist philosopher, who says that statement. I can't remember which chapter. I think I start the negativity chapter with that quote. So it's Daisaku Ikeda, Buddhist philosopher, and he says exactly that you can't build your own happiness on the unhappiness of others. And I think what that truly means is we often believe that we can only be superior if someone else is inferior. So we feel better when we say, oh, you know that person, did you know that couple's getting a divorce? Oh, did you know their marriage only lasted like 2 years? And what you're really saying is, well, we've somehow managed to stay together for 8 years. Like, we've done pretty all right, right? And you're kind of gossiping about them. Or another way it goes is like, oh, did you hear about him? He's totally messed it up. Like, he's getting fired next week. And all you're doing is you're making someone feel inferior to make yourself feel superior. That doesn't create happiness. It creates more uncertain ground, because now you're constantly looking for someone else to feel inferior for you to feel superior. And guess what? God forbid someone's now outperforming you. You're now feeling inferior, and you're feeling all the insecurity of what you felt about someone else. So it's never a stable ground, right? I believe it's in the Bible, but you can't, I think it's that you can't build your home on shifting sands. But in the same way, you can't build a stable identity of yourself on the gossip or the mistakes of others. And so you've got to be really careful about not building a ground for yourself. Imagine the ground you're standing on is built on blocks of superiority, bricks of gossip, and mud and cement of criticism. That's not going to hold. And so you don't want to create your joy because other people are struggling or suffering. You want to create your joy because you know how to deal with struggle and suffering.
Yeah. So beautifully explained. And I think we often write the quotes down that really mean a lot to us. And I certainly feel for me, that was something I spent a lot of my adult life really trying to come to terms with and realizing, I used to be so competitive, if I won a game of snooker or table tennis or, it would literally elevate me. And if I lost, man, I would be down in the dumps. Like it would, and I've really explored this, and given the time we've got left, I sort of probably can't go down this rabbit hole. But I know one component is that as a kid, how I did at school, and again, I don't know if this was the same in your household. I know a lot of immigrant families have this sort of mentality. If you got 98%, it's like, well, why was it not 100%?
Yeah, for sure.
You were like, oh, what? You came second in that test. Why? What happened? Who was first? Why didn't you come first?
Yes.
And I actually think, whilst and my mum will say, because I've spoken to her about this recently, she said, well, I knew you were capable, so I wanted you to be the best you could. And okay, and I think she was doing the best she could. I would say for me, the way I interpreted it was that I can only be loved. I can only be feel good about myself when I'm number one. And really, I'd say over the last sort of 5 years, that's pretty much almost gone from me now. I'm pretty okay with it now. Like, I don't feel, and I think that is, I think it's such an important quote that you've shared, because I sort of think now, and we should probably talk about social media a bit, because you're pretty much the king of social media in so many ways. And I think I'd love to know some of your thoughts on social media. But with respect to that quote, I think one of the negatives, and there've no doubt been a lot of positives of social media, you have shared such amazing wisdom in your videos to millions of people around the world, which potentially may not have happened without social media, right? So it's not about saying it's either good or bad. But I do think for some people, it can magnify those insecurities. So if you feel that you can build your happiness on the unhappiness of others, people can get very focused on follow accounts and likes. And I certainly know in the UK medic world, there's a lot of medics feel a pressure to be building up their profiles and have contacted me saying, I'm not sure what to do. And you think, wow, it's causing such discontentment. And it's just a metric that in so many levels, I'm not going to say it's meaningless. Of course, it's not meaningless. But if you're trying to do it because how you'll be perceived by others, going back to what we've been talking about throughout this conversation, what are you posting for? What are you hoping to achieve by posting it? Is it in service? Is it to help people? Or is it to elevate yourself? Yeah. I don't know, maybe you can untangle that some for us, because I'm sure some people listening will be thinking that.
Yeah, there's very few creators of content on social media that started out with a follow account in mind. So me included, a lot of my peers in this space, a lot of people that I know that are extremely successful on different platforms, none of them started, at least the ones that I know, none of them started to get followers. They all started because they had something to share, whatever that was, whether it was comedy, whether it's wisdom, whether it was a workout plan, a fitness plan, whatever it was, like they had something that they did that they were passionate about, they wanted to share. And I can only speak to myself fully, but when I started, I thought I was going to have a full-time corporate job and I was going to make videos on the evenings and weekends to share a message. That's genuinely all I believed. And after my first month, I had about 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, about 4 videos I'd made on YouTube. I had about 1,000 people that had subscribed to my channel. And most of my friends were like, great, Jay, that's where it's going to end. Like, congrats, well done. Like, you got 1,000 subscribers. You kind of just crept in there in 30 days. Like, well done, that's cool. Like, how far is this going to go? And that's really the reality of what it felt like. And the interesting thing is, the question was never, how do I get more followers? The question was always, how do I make more content that impacts people? Because, and that's the question with everything. It's like, if you make more content that genuinely impacts people, you'll get more followers. If you build a business that serves more people, you'll make more money. If you help a lot of people through your talents and gifts, you will be famous and known for it. Like, it's a byproduct of doing something properly. And that's why I love the definition that Peter Diamandis gives, that we should redefine the word billionaire to be someone who impacts the lives of 1 billion people. Why is Jeff Bezos the richest man in the world? Because he's created a product that we all say we want and that it solves a problem that we really need. And so if you want to get followers, don't look at the number. Ask yourself, are you really creating the value that's going to help people? And they're going to naturally want to follow you. And they're going to want to love your work and share it. Because to me, that's the worthwhile pursuit in life. Because when you do that work is humbling. When you do that creativity, that's the part that makes you grateful for the success that you get, because you go, wow, like people actually care about what I have to say. But if you're just obsessed about numbers and metrics without being obsessed by the content, the creation, and the service, then you'll never be satisfied, because there'll always be someone better than you. So for me, when I set out to write this book, so many people were like, oh, so do you want this book to be a bestseller? And I said, I want this book to be a bestseller. Of course I do. But I'm not going to focus on it being a bestseller. I'm going to focus on writing the best book in the world that I can possibly write, given the skills that I have. And that's why when I talk about Dharma in the book, which is helping everyone find their purpose, Dharma is broken down. Dharma means purpose loosely, and has many different meanings, but one of them is nature and purpose, your true nature. And the three aspects that I'll share now and there's more depth in the book, the three aspects of Dharma are your passion, your skills, and your compassion. That's what it means. When you have your passion plus your skills plus your compassion, that equals purpose. But for most of us, if we're just looking at numbers and metrics and data, I mean, you'll be dissatisfied that. And I'm saying that as someone who really values numbers. I understand the value of followers, social media. I get the value of all those things, and I'm highly strategic. But I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not focused on the number. I'm focused on making content. And that's the message, that if we're focused on really creating value in the world, all of the other stuff will come naturally. You don't have to go out and separately try and get it. And, Rangan, you've done a great job of this. You've made content that's very organic to you. You've made content that's very natural to you. And I think that's what people gravitate towards you in your podcast and your books, because it's you being yourself. You're not trying to sound like someone else. You're not trying to be someone else. And if you look at the most successful creators in the world, they're all like that. They've just really shared their raw personality with others.
If you enjoyed that conversation, I think you are really going to enjoy the one I had with Peter Crone. It's just there, so give it a click and let me know what you think.
I tell people you can't create the life of someone you don't yet believe yourself to be, right? It's not going to work because you're going against the grain of how you're fundamentally conditioned.